Today, we're going to discuss the mythopoeic origins of Chinese philosophers. We'll focus on the significance of Scapulimancy in the Shang dynasty, the earliest Chinese dynasty with definite archaeological evidence of its existence. Shang is the source of the earliest forms of Chinese writing, mostly in the form of divination records. As you can imagine, it is decisive in shaping the contents and directionality of Chinese philosophies, which follow in the subsequent dynasties. In the previous talk about ancient Greece, we saw that Greek philosophy was invented in part as a reaction against the mythological image of the world. The first step in this reaction against mythology was the coordination of the anthropomorphic deities, each belonging to parochial cults with idiosyncratic beliefs and practices, into a unified genealogy. This coordination signifies, above all, two things. First, the possibility of an externally coherent ordering between the gods. Second, a possibility of an internally coherent order which the gods must obey. In other words, these were the beginnings of natural science. Hence, the very first Greek philosophers, from Thales to Anaximander to Pythagoras to Heraclitus to Parmenides, all enthusiastically pursued the question of what the world is made of. Lineages of philosophies of this Grecian origin share this characteristic preoccupation with metaphysics long afterwards. The most significant difference between the Greek philosophers and the Chinese philosophers is that the early Greek philosophers were uninterested in politics and political philosophy, whereas the early Chinese philosophers began with politics. This may be confusing, considering Plato's status as the quintessential Greek philosopher, and of course he focused greatly on politics, and the influence of ancient Greek and post-Hellenic philosophies on the course of global political thought. However, recall that the pre-Socratics were all motivated by cosmological questions of what the universe consists of. For the Greeks, ethical and political questions did not come to the fore until the density of the intellectual networks and the level of abstraction in the arguments were sufficiently raised. For the Chinese, metaphysics only came to the fore as a consequence of questions regarding human nature, namely, whether it was naturally prosocial, antisocial, or social. The Chinese civilization, like all civilizations, has a mythopoeic past. They too live in a world of gods and magic. But the gods and the magic preceding the earliest turning point of Chinese thought were different from those of the Greeks. Here, a healthy dose of environmental determinism may help our understanding along. A common theme within environmental determinism is that the worse the climate, the crueler the gods. And of course, the crueler the gods, the more extreme the offerings have to be in order to appease the gods and to seek their protection. Greece was mild, promoting an outdoors lifestyle, including the literal marketplace of ideas. China was subject to the cruelty of the gods, who brought them frequent droughts and floods, a major concern for the Shang rulers who ruled near the Yellow River, which frequently flooded and caused calamities. Chinese dynasties during this time were much less unified than the ones in the eras following the Qin unification of China in 221 BCE, and were instead a loose confederacy of feudal states that jostled for military supremacy. The Shang ruled directly over the core of the so-called 10,000 state system, only indirectly ruling over the more distant vassal states which offered them tributes. And these vassal states, the further they were from the core, the less influence the Shang rulers had over them, and they rebelled frequently. The Shang people engaged in large-scale human sacrifice, usually consisting of conquered enemies, but sometimes of their own people also. Whereas the Greeks coordinated the gods through a genealogy, the Chinese coordinated their gods through a bureaucracy. Initially, the various elements of the climate themselves were considered gods. Even the character for these weather events referred to the gods themselves. Yu, rain, meant the god of rain, and so on. A king of these gods was introduced later. This king of the gods, Di, gave orders to the lesser gods and did not communicate directly with the humans. Some later historical records, still ancient, claimed that in the very earliest days of the world, humans did not communicate even with the spirits or the lesser gods, until shamans and shamanesses who possessed the wisdom and the inspiration to communicate with the spiritual world were born. As part of the coordination of the gods, multiple gods overseeing the same natural phenomena were fused into a singular god with a bureaucratic position under Di, such as the god of thunder or the god of rain. Di was too sacred still and distant still for humans to communicate with directly. Instead, the Shang kings communicated indirectly with Di through the help of the nature gods and dead ancestors, who themselves became gods under the command of Di. Over time, the oldest and therefore the most mythic ancestors came to be increasingly identified with Di. At the same time, Di itself came to be considered an ancestor, the oldest and the greatest of them all. So, Di was an amalgamation of multiple deities, only it partly consisted of dead kings. And of course, the part that was made up of the dead kings grew as more and more kings passed on. All deceased rulers were added to the pantheon of the gods. The oldest kings increasingly moved closer to becoming part of Di, which could be communicated with. This was a procession of divinity in which the distance between the generations added sacrality to the dead ancestors, and the succession of kingship secured the religious power of the kings through a monopoly over divine communication. In this way, anthropomorphism in Chinese theology signifies an increase of order, rather than representing the human-like unpredictability of nature as in the Greek world. The Shang kings communicated with Di through Scapulimancy, with the lesser gods as the messengers in between. In particular, they practiced pyromantic scapulimancy, in which they induced cracks in the shoulder blade bone with heat and read their meanings. Scapulimancy is interesting for being a global phenomenon, with several cultures around the world developing it independently. Native Americans, Native Canadians, Greeks, Zulus, Mongolians. Many cultures, usually rural farmers and indigenous hunters, still practice it to this day. Now, it's hard to find any discussion of scapulimancy on YouTube, but I found 2 videos on the topic, both under 300 views. A podcast episode from the Open Resourcery provides a witchcraft subculturalist perspective on scapulimancy. She says that she gets the ick from Chinese scapulimancy because the practice of drilling holes in the bones before inducing cracks by sticking rods of hot metal into the holes reduces the randomness and seems to allow a great deal of control and influence for the diviner over the outcomes. This was a surprisingly incisive observation. I think it comes from her experience being a tarot reader online, a professional tarot reader. As we'll see, limiting randomness is an important aspect of Chinese divination techniques, both in the process of generating the fortunes to be read as well as in the interpretation itself, because it is a two-way communication between the diviner and the gods, as opposed to fortune-telling as merely a predictive activity. In the other video I found, the anthropologist Adrian Tanner discusses his research into the scapulimancy of the Cree and Innu peoples native to Canada. Among the Cree and the Innu peoples of Canada, scapulimancy is practiced to this day, most often as a way to decide where to hunt next. Professor Tanner finds it strange that the extremely knowledgeable and experienced hunters would want to depend on fortune-telling to guide them, and lists 3 competing hypotheses for why they practice scapulimancy. First, it may be that the practice discourages the hunters from revisiting hunting grounds. Hunters are inclined to return to the locations where they found success, but animals often become wary of hunters and stop returning to the same place. Second, it may be that the practice enhances group harmony by allowing the group to share in the responsibility for making decisions, or by shifting the blame onto non-human entities beyond the group when things go wrong. Third, part of Tanner's own theory is that it may be that the rituals reinforce and validate existing worldviews held by the group retroactively, a case supported by the fact that the meaning of the oracles are only fully understood by the group through the unfolding of the very outcomes which they ostensibly predicted. Often, the meaning of the oracles are never explained at all. A typical bone reading session for the Korean Innu consists of a wise bone reader holding a shoulder blade over a fire with a stick, and then passing the bone around for all adult members of a group to examine the cracks. Children are hidden away in order to protect them against the powerful magic of work. Nonetheless, this is a rather informal and egalitarian affair, in which even a visitor to the group, such as ethnographers, can be included. Shang's Scapulimancy was quite different. Above all, there's the matter of the divine hierarchy. Humans cannot communicate directly with Di, and instead must rely on the lesser gods. These lesser gods, though they directly influence mortal affairs such as the weather or the outcomes of wars, are only permitted to act with the express order of Di. Certain gods are closer to the humans and more responsive, as are the most recently deceased ancestors. The most important gods are the 5 vassals of Di: the god of rain, the god of clouds, the god of wind, the god of thunder, and the god of lightning. These 5 gods of the weather are not only the most important for agricultural reasons, but are also the most efficient messengers of Di. So, it becomes crucial for the diviners to be exacting. Shang's Scapulimancy queries became highly structured and included specific details such as who is asking the question, when, as part of what ritual, and at which god or ancestor. A fascinating detail of proto-logic is that the Shang Scapulimancers would ask the questions to the gods in negative pairs in order to clarify the meaning of the oracles. For instance, will Di order the rain god to bring a flood on so-and-so day would be paired with, will Di not order the rain god to bring a flood on so-and-so day? And each question would be written symmetrically, such as on either side of a turtle shell. When matters were urgent and the diviners wished to impress this upon the gods, they would repeat the same question multiple times, simply recording how many times they did so at the end of the inscription, such as will Di order the rain god to bring a flood on so-and-so day? 4, as in they asked the question 4 times. To the ancient Chinese, divination rituals were communication protocols. Precision of language was all important. Now here is Karen Wang discussing persuasion and propaganda in ancient China. Hanzi was not invented to transcribe the spoken language, nor was it intended to facilitate communication among the masses. Quite the opposite. It was painstakingly cryptographic by design, keeping access to the divine will of Zhangdi exclusive to a small group of literati elites, thereby legitimizing their claim to the divine right of kings. Okay, she's discussing specifically the logographic nature of the Chinese language. The ideographic language of Chinese language. Okay, so the Chinese language, the script, begins as depictions of the ideas expressed by the writing, rather than symbolizing the sounds made by the spoken language. And one of the consequences of the Chinese language being this way means that even though the different states in the Shang dynasty speak different languages, they can nonetheless access the meaning of the shared script. And you can see this even in contemporary Chinese, where the Cantonese and the Mandarin speakers speak the different languages, but they still rely on the same Chinese written script. And this becomes very important for the operation and organization of the state cult, even following on from the Shang dynasty, namely in the Zhou dynasty. So the plurality of the gods, the lesser gods, in spite of the centralized rule of the heavens under Shangdi, promoted the development of a granular vocabulary for the Shang. Alongside different words for the different gods themselves, the Shang also developed words to describe the types of offering offered to the gods. Words for dog, human, female, married woman, single woman, servants, and even officers of the state, as well as methods of sacrifice such as burning, drowning, burying, and cutting into pieces, and the purpose of the offering, such as at a temple or to exorcise evil spirits out of the court. These words for the methods were particularly important, as different gods demanded different modes of sacrifice, such as the river gods demanding a drowning, the earth gods demanding a burying, the sky gods demanding a burning, and the wind gods demanding mutilation. Good communication was key to a successful negotiation with the gods, and offering sacrifices which correctly met the demands of the appropriate gods conferred protection. Hence, the Chinese language was crucial for the mobilization and legitimization of violence at a massive scale, turning the state into a sprawling infrastructure run on blood and prayer. When the Zhou dynasty defeated the Shang and usurped the power, they absorbed Shang culture, language, and religion, and adapted them for their own ends. In other words, they inherited a divine bureaucracy consisting of an elaborate communications network between heaven and earth, which was essential for the continued functioning of the tenuous proto-empire. This infrastructure was so important that the Zhou built a special city for ritual ceremonies, in which they installed Shang specialists to carry out ceremonies on behalf of the Zhou state. The Zhou adopted the Shang written script, the practice of divination, the ancestor worshipping religion, and the concept of Di. Adopting the script was easy enough. The Shang and the Zhou spoke similar languages, and the Zhou had already begun adopting the Shang language, partly through the bilingual Zhou elite. The divination practice was further developed into a bureaucratic form with far greater reach and formal consistency, to be carried out by specially trained officials of the state rather than being restricted to the king and his divinely inspired shamans. It was also the Zhou who introduced the method of divination using yarrow stalks instead of bones, which was much cheaper. The Shang often had to go on hunting expeditions in order to procure both the sacrifices and the bones used in the divination practices, whereas the yarrow stalks just grew in the courtyards of temples, and best of all, the stalks could be reused. This method of yielding a series of binary numbers gave rise to the hexagrams, a set of shapes corresponding to 6-digit binary numbers with important symbolic meaning. The adoption of ancestor worship was much more challenging, as you can imagine, because the Zhou did not share the same ancestors as the Shang. And also challenging was the concept of Di itself, which by now had become intimately linked to the worship of the ancestors. And so the Zhou transformed the Shang religion by displacing Di with Tian, or heaven, and introducing the concept of the mandate of heaven. Whereas to the Shang, it was the unbroken lineage of the deified kings which legitimized the rule, the Zhou now claimed that Di and the ancestor gods decided which regime to support based on moral standards. Of course, it was just this moral standard which the Shang, particularly with their corrupt and decadent last king, had abandoned. The Shang were the first to lose the mandate of heaven, and the Zhou were the first to gain it. The first philosophical text in Chinese history, the I Ching, appears during the Western Zhou dynasty, somewhere between 1000 BCE and around 750 BC. Yet the first Chinese philosopher, Confucius, does not appear until around 500 BC, several centuries later. The I Ching, or Book of Changes, is a divination text. You can look up one of 64 unique shapes called hexagrams, each of which consists of 2 trigrams stacked together. and read ambiguous oracles such as perseverance brings good fortune, remorse disappears, or it does not further one to go anywhere. These are sort of now most popularly spread throughout Western culture in the form of fortune cookies. You see, in and of itself, it is a symbolically rich and highly evocative text, but it's not philosophy per se. However, over the centuries, the book became one of the most important classics in all of Chinese history, and indeed all of human history. This was thanks to what is known as the commentarial tradition in Chinese philosophy. The Chinese philosophers, beginning with Confucius, often claimed to merely be transmitting the knowledge of their predecessors rather than developing anything original. They presented their very much original philosophy in the form of commentaries on ancient texts, using them as an anchor to the past that conferred upon them legitimacy as philosophers. Note the isomorphic pattern here. The Shang rulers derived their legitimacy from their dialogue with the gods and the ancestors. The philosophers derived their legitimacy from their dialogue with the often mythologized and deified sages and proto-philosophers. The I Ching was a perfect choice as a philosopher's oracle. Its mathematical purity and symbolic richness so impressed Leibniz that he came to believe that it held the power, an answer to everything from the proof of God's existence to the key to a universal language of thought, an alphabet of thought that Leibniz was attempting to develop. And he himself wrote a commentary on the I Ching in 1703. 2 centuries later, Leibniz's work, inspired by the I Ching, eventually led to the development of Boolean logic and the beginnings of analytic philosophy itself, which is the dominant form of philosophy in the world now. I Ching divination itself is enduringly popular as a method of fortune-telling. That's it for today's talk. In the next talk, I may or may not cover, depending on where the research ends up taking me, the beginnings of Chinese philosophy proper, starting with Confucius and Mozi, especially focusing on the continued significance of language and logic, with Confucius focusing on correct ritual and language, and Mozi and the Mohists inventing logic to discuss the ethics of language, and the 2 cases for peace amongst the warring states that these 2 philosophers present, namely Confucius' ultra-conservatism and the call for a return to the Zhou state of a unified state ruled by a virtuous ruler, which is an internal critique of Zhou ethics, using the mandate of heaven prescriptively this time instead of retroactively as a way of legitimize the takeover by the Zhou. The Mohist proto-socialist case for the coexistence of the multiple states and an end to war itself. An external critique of Confucianism that proposes a new politics based on a new ethics. And the Mohists are especially interesting in that not only do they advance this new politics through their philosophical theories, but they also go around inventing new techniques and engineering feats, marvels of engineering, which innovate upon the techniques of defensive warfare, because the Mohists argue that if defensive warfare technologies surpass offensive warfare enough, offensive warfare will become futile, and therefore all war will end. And I'll also probably discuss the material conditions of the Warring States period underlying this phase of Chinese philosophy, the context of the broader network of philosophers, and informative points of comparison with the ancient Greeks. I hope you enjoyed that. See you next time.